Welcome back to Creepy Vibes. Tonight I have a collection of true, unsettling Home Alone horror stories from Texas. Each of these encounters happened when people thought they were safe, alone in their own homes. From sinister knocking at the door to shadows that shouldn't be there and voices only meant to be heard by the unfortunate. These stories are sure to make you question every sound you hear tonight. As always, make sure you're in a dark room with your headphones on for the best experience. Before we begin, make sure to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share your own experiences in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there, because some stories are best heard when the world is asleep. Now, let's get into it. It was a sweltering night in Midland, Texas, when 16-year-old Katie was left alone for the weekend. Her parents had gone to Houston for a wedding, leaving her with a well-stocked fridge, an overcharged cell phone, and firm instructions to lock all doors by sundown. The heat had turned the air thick, pressing against the windows like something alive. Their modest house sat on the edge of a sprawling development that had stalled halfway to completion, leaving most of the lots empty. Scrub brush grew wild in the vacant patches of land. Katie always hated the way the shadows spilled long and dark across the dirt when the sun set. The house itself was a boxy, two-story thing that felt too large for the three of them. Her father had insisted they needed the space, said they'd grow into it. But Katie thought it felt hollow, like a drum. Sounds carried too well. Footsteps thumped through the ceiling if you so much as tiptoed. Every faucet had its own peculiar groan. At night, it wasn't the darkness that made her uncomfortable, but the noise. The creaks and murmurs that sounded too much like voices. But she wasn't afraid of the dark. Not really. Her mother used to joke that Katie was born with a stubborn streak, her little fists clenched and her blue eyes screwed tight as if she'd already decided not to cry. So she spent the first night alone, sprawled on the couch with her phone in one hand and the TV remote in the other, trying to find something worth streaming. The first scratch came around midnight. It was a slow, deliberate sound against the back door, like nails dragged across the screen door's flimsy mesh. She laughed it off as a stray cat or some critter rooting around for scraps. The coyotes were known to get bold around there, especially when the nights grew hotter. But the scratching came again and again, louder, more calculated. Katie turned off the TV and strained her ears against the silence. Nothing. Just the air conditioning rumbling softly and her own heartbeat ticking in her throat. "Jesus, you're paranoid," she whispered to herself. She slid the bolt lock on the back door just to be safe and made her way to her bedroom. Katie had always been a light sleeper, the smallest sounds enough to stir her awake. So, when she woke to the hollow clatter of something tipping, over in the kitchen around 2 a.m, she sat bolt upright, her skin prickled with sweat, her sheets twisted around her legs. She waited, clutching her phone to her chest. The silence settled back, but it didn't feel right. It felt bruised, as if something was holding its breath just beyond her line of sight. By morning, the memory of the scratching had already begun to fade. She wandered into the kitchen and found a dish lying broken on the floor. It had been on the far counter the night before, and yet there it lay, shards glinting like jagged teeth in the sunlight. She cleaned up the mess, pushing the incident to the back of her mind, blaming herself for placing it too close to the edge. But a part of her, small and sharp, wondered if the scratching and the broken dish were connected. The next night she heard it again. The same clawing sound, but this time it came from the window closest to her bedroom. A quick, urgent scrabbling, like something trying to gain purchase, on the glass. She peeked through the blinds and saw nothing but the backyard swaying gently under the moonlight. But the quiet had taken on a texture, thick and syrupy, coating her senses with dread. She barely slept, her ears straining for every bump, every groan of the house settling. She almost called her parents, but decided against it. They'd just think she was being dramatic. They already worried too much about her ever since the move. It was supposed to be a fresh start, but Midland felt like a place where people came to hide from themselves. By the third night, Katie had convinced herself she was imagining things. She called her mom, laughing nervously about the scratches. "You're just jumpy, honey. Lock the doors and go to bed." But at 3 a.m. she woke to the unmistakable sound of nails dragging against glass. Not just at the window, but on every window of the house. Scratching, scratching, scratching. A symphony of claws and desperation. She lay still, every muscle locked, tight. The sounds moved, circling the house, scrabbling along the walls, the roof, the door frames. They never paused, never ceased. They only grew more frantic as the hours bled into dawn. The sun rose, and the scratching finally stopped. Katie spent the rest of the morning pacing the living room, her body slicked with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. When her parents returned that afternoon, her father checked the yard. What he found made his face turn pale. Deep gouges were carved into the wood of every window frame, like something had been trying to dig its way in. "Katie," her father said, his voice a low rasp. "You said you heard scratching?" "Yes," she whispered. Her hands trembled. He paused, swallowing hard. "There's blood on the wood. Whatever was trying to get in, it was bleeding." He showed her the red-brown smears, crusted along the gouges. It was too much for an animal. And the marks? They were too precise, too deliberate. Katie's mother spent the next week filing police reports, insisting they change all the locks, board up the windows. But Katie knew it wouldn't help. Whatever it was, it hadn't been trying to break in. It had been trying to lure her out. The storm had blown in fierce and sudden that autumn night, a dry, crackling wind scraping across the plains like a knife. Michael and Alex sat huddled in their family's creaky old farmhouse near Amarillo, the kind of place where the roof groaned, in a stiff breeze and the wood walls breathed with the weather. Their parents had left for a late-night shift at the hospital, promising to be back by morning. "Don't stay up too late," Mom had said, her voice frazzled as she fumbled for her purse by the front door. "And keep the doors locked, no excuses." Yeah, Michael had replied, his tone dripping with a teenage boredom that bordered on rebellion. He was 14, all gangly arms and shaggy hair, his voice deepening into something that sounded too much like their father's. Alex was 11, smaller, quieter, a shadow that followed Michael from room to room, eyes wide and curious, but with something more delicate lingering beneath the surface. The kind of boy who flinched at sharp sounds and sometimes slept with the light on. The power went out around 10 o'clock. One second they were watching some slasher flick Michael had insisted wasn't that bad. The next the screen went dark, the house swallowed by a sudden and absolute silence. Damn it. Michael clicked his flashlight on, sweeping the beam over the room. The yellow light made everything look sick, distorted. Generators probably out again. Alex shifted nervously, clutching the bowl of popcorn like it was some sort of shield. "Should we check the basement?" "No point. Dad said he'd fix the damn thing weeks ago. Just grab your flashlight." They made a fort out of blankets in the living room, more for Alex's comfort than Michael's. Piled high with pillows, snacks, and a battery-powered radio that crackled with static. It was cozy, safe, but the dark stretched long and deep beyond, their little fortress. Michael tried to keep the mood light, making jokes and daring Alex to tell a ghost story. But Alex's eyes kept wandering to the windows, where the branches scratched against the glass like brittle fingers. Around 11, Alex went to the kitchen to grab another bag of chips. Michael heard the crunch of his sneakers on the old wood floor, the creak of a cabinet door, the rattle of plastic. Then nothing. "Alex?" Michael called, but his voice was met only by the soft hum of the wind pushing against the house. He clicked on his flashlight and found Alex standing near the kitchen window, his eyes fixed on something outside. Something beyond the warped glass, out there where the land rolled flat and unforgiving. "What are you looking at?" Michael's voice was too loud in the stillness. I thought I saw someone. Someone? Crawling. Michael laughed, but it was a forced, brittle sound. Probably a coyote, or a raccoon or something. "You're being stupid." But even as he said it, he found himself glancing out the window. The darkness was thick, velvety, the kind of dark that seemed to shift and breathe. They returned to their makeshift fort, but the mood had soured. The radio spit and hissed, unable to cling to a signal for more than a few seconds at a time. Michael noticed Alex's fingers were trembling. An hour later, something rattled the doorknob. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the back door. Tap, tap, tap. "Wind," Michael said, but the word was thin, unconvincing. Alex crept to the door, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. He peered through the peephole, his eye pressed so tight to the glass he thought it might burst. Michael saw the way his little brother went pale, like the blood had just drained out of him. "What?" Michael asked, his voice cracking. "What? Did you see?" A man. Crawling. He was dragging himself up the porch steps. Bullshit. Alex's face was twisted, his eyes shimmering with panic. His elbows were bleeding, so were his knees. And when he saw me, he smiled. Michael swallowed, throat gone dry, his fingers tightened around the handle of the flashlight, knuckles aching. "It's a joke," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was a lie. For the next few hours, they sat clutching knives from the kitchen, their backs pressed against the wall. The tapping came and went, soft at times, furious at others. Sometimes they could hear the scrape of flesh against wood, a sick, wet sound like meat dragged over gravel. The whispers started around 2 in the morning, low, guttural things threading their way through the walls. Things they couldn't quite make out, but the tone was unmistakable, something pleading, something hungry. When their parents returned just before dawn, they found the boys curled up on the couch, pale and trembling, the knives still gripped in their hands. Their mother kept shouting at them to speak, to explain why the porch was splattered with blood, why deep gouges had been dug into the wood like something had been clawing its way in. The police found no sign of a man, no footprints, no trail of blood leading away from the house, just the dark stains smeared across the porch. And Alex, who wouldn't speak for a week, his eyes hollow and sleepless. But Michael heard the whispering sometimes, just at the edge of sleep, a rasping voice scratching at his mind like nails against glass. And he was sure, absolutely sure, that the man was still crawling. Amy had never liked living so far from the city, but the cheap rent and quiet nights had lured her in like so many others looking for a fresh start. Her little house on the outskirts of San Antonio sat cradled between twisted oaks and dry, hard-packed earth. It was a one-story thing with creaky floors and a roof that groaned under the weight of every passing storm. But it was hers. Bailey, her golden retriever, was the only constant in her life. She'd adopted him 2 years prior, a rescue, with sad eyes and a heart too big for his own good. Bailey had a bark like a cannon, but rarely used it. He was friendly, eager to please, the sort of dog who'd nuzzle your hand even if you snapped at him. So, when he began barking one cool October night, Amy's first thought was to laugh it off. She was curled up on her frayed old couch with a book and a mug of tea gone cold. Bailey was usually content to lie at her feet, his tail thumping softly whenever she scratched behind his ears. But this was different. Bailey's bark was frantic, the kind of sound that clawed its way up from his chest like something alive. He was at the back door, his fur bristling, teeth bared, a snarl building in his throat. "What the hell's gotten into you?" Amy muttered, setting her book aside. She rose to her feet, joints cracking in the quiet. Bailey's barking only grew louder, his paws scratching at the door like he was trying to dig his way through. His eyes were wide and wild, fixed on something just beyond the glass. Amy flipped the porch light on and swung the door open, half expecting to find a raccoon or some stray dog nosing around the garbage cans. But there was nothing. Just the flat, indifferent night. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their shadows twisting like fingers over the dry ground. "See?" she said, her voice trembling despite her best effort to sound firm. Nothing there. But Bailey wouldn't budge. His growl deepened, his gaze still locked on the darkness beyond the porch. "Bailey, come on." She grabbed his collar and tugged. But he only planted his paws harder against the floor, his muscles quivering. An hour later, and he was still at it, barking, growling, his hackles raised. Amy tried to ignore it, tried to lose herself in her book, but the sound burrowed into her skull like a splinter. It was close to midnight when the knock came. Soft, polite. 3 gentle taps against the front door. Bailey erupted into a frenzy, his barking sharper, more desperate. Amy's breath hitched, her skin prickling with a sudden chill. She rose from the couch, her legs unsteady. The peephole showed nothing, just darkness, thick and still. Bailey's growling turned guttural, a sound she'd never heard him make before. It was raw, almost feral. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice thin and trembling. Silence. Bailey barked so hard she thought he might tear his own throat apart. She dragged him away from the door, his nails scraping furrows into the hardwood. She locked him in the bedroom, his barking muffled but still feverish. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Amy's heart pounded, her pulse a dull roar in her ears. She looked through the peephole again, her hand shaking, and then she heard it. A voice, thin, whispering, right against the door. Words she couldn't quite catch but could feel all the same. Something wrong with the tone, too high, too eager. "Let me in," it whispered. She stumbled back, her mind swimming. Bailey's barking grew frantic, his claws raking against the bedroom door. Amy backed away until she hit the kitchen counter. She fumbled for her phone but found only emptiness. She'd left it charging in the bedroom. Another knock, so forceful, it rattled the door on its hinges. She ran to her bedroom, wrenching the door open. Bailey shot past her, his barking wild, uncontrollable. He threw himself at the front door, teeth snapping, foam flecking his muzzle. And then, nothing. Bailey stopped. His body went rigid, his barking cut off like a wire snipped clean. He stared at the door, his chest heaving, eyes rolling white. "Amy," the voice spoke again, but this time it was Bailey's voice. The same pitch, the same inflection. "Amy, let me in." She collapsed to the floor, her legs gone to jelly. Bailey's head jerked toward her, his eyes wide, confused, as if he had heard it too. She didn't sleep that night, kept every light on, kept Bailey close, his body trembling against her leg. The knocks never returned, but sometimes, late at night when the world grew too quiet, she'd hear a voice on the other side of the door, a voice that sounded just like Bailey. Jason had never wanted to move to the new place, but his parents insisted it was a fresh start, a bigger house, a better neighborhood, all those promises adults make to justify uprooting their kids' lives. The development was so new that most of the houses around them were half-built skeletons, their frames jutting up against the night like broken ribs. Just outside Dallas, the subdivision was mostly fields and empty lots, all sprawled beneath a vast, uncaring sky. 17 and angry about everything, Jason had spent the first few weeks sulking in his room, headphones on, eyes glued to his computer screen. Anything to keep the loneliness at bay. His parents had left that Friday for a weekend getaway, some anniversary trip to a cabin by a lake. "You'll be fine, Jace," his mother had said before they'd driven off. "Just keep the doors locked and don't burn the place down." Jason had nodded absently, already planning his solo weekend of video games and cheap pizza. The night settled in thick and quiet, only the hum of his console breaking the silence. The house was one of the few completed ones on the street, the others just frames and scattered piles of lumber. A streetlight buzzed weakly outside his window, its glow pale and sickly. Around midnight, the power cut out. The screen went dark with a pop, the sudden silence pressing down on him like a heavy, wet blanket. Jason cursed, his voice a small, brittle thing swallowed by the dark. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, the thin beam slicing through the black. Thunder rumbled far off. Maybe the power was knocked out by a storm brewing somewhere. That's what he told himself anyway. But as he moved through the house, checking the breakers with hands that trembled more than he'd like to admit, something caught his eye through the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. A figure. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. The beam of his phone's flashlight trembled in his hand, bouncing weakly against the glass. It stood near the edge of the yard, just beyond the brittle remains of the builder's silt fence, tall, impossibly thin. Its limbs jittered and twitched, the movement too quick, too erratic to be natural, almost like something struggling to maintain a shape. "Fuck," Jason whispered. He blinked, wiped his eyes, looked again. The figure was gone. He let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head. Must have been a trick of the light. A shadow cast by the half-finished houses or a tree swaying in the breeze. But the air outside was still, oppressively so. Jason forced himself back to his room, slamming the door behind him. He sank onto his bed, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The power hadn't come back on, but he couldn't bring himself to care. An hour passed, maybe 2. Jason lay on his bed, phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. He'd just started to drift off when the phone buzzed. A message, unknown number. He stared at the screen, his mind sluggish with the edges of sleep. The notification pulsed gently, waiting to be opened. He tapped it. It was a photo. Jason's blood ran cold as he stared at the image. His own bedroom window. The photo was taken from outside, angled upward as if someone had been standing just beneath the sill. Another buzz. Another photo. This time, it was a close-up of the window, his own reflection faintly visible in the glass. And behind him, just over his shoulder, was the figure. Tall, thin, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, eyes wide and gleaming with something that felt like hunger. Jason threw the phone across the room, his breathing sharp and ragged. He leapt from the bed and flicked on the overhead light. The power was back. The room bathed in pale yellow light, but the window was open. Jason didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He kept every light in the house blazing, his phone clenched in his hand like a weapon. The police found nothing the next morning, no footprints, no sign of forced entry. They told him it was probably a prank, that teenagers had a knack for messing with each other in weird, unsettling ways. Jason knew better. A month later, he'd convinced his parents to move. He never told them why, never explained why he insisted on keeping his curtains drawn, why he jumped every time his phone buzzed. Sometimes, though, when he was alone and his mind started playing tricks on him, he swore he could still see the figure, flickering in the darkness. Grace was 15 when her parents decided she was old enough to stay home alone. The old ranch house outside Lubbock wasn't exactly isolated, but the nearest neighbor was a good mile down the road. To Grace, it felt like being stranded on an island in the middle of the prairie. Her father loved the place, always bragging about its history, about how it had been built by some cattle baron in the 1920s. Sturdy bones, he'd say, like the house itself was a living thing. Grace didn't care much for history, especially not the creaky floorboards and rattling windows that groaned whenever the wind kicked up dust from the fields. Her parents had gone to visit her grandmother for the weekend, just 2 nights. Grace could handle it. She had snacks, movies queued up, her phone charged. What else did she need? The first night passed uneventfully. Grace lost herself in a horror movie marathon, half watching the films while scrolling on her phone. By midnight, she was already yawning, stretching out on the worn leather couch wrapped in a fleece blanket. She woke to the sound of knocking. 3 sharp, deliberate raps against the front door. Grace sat up, her pulse quickening. She glanced at her phone. 2:12 a.m. The ranch was far enough from town that no one should have been out there at that hour. Another series of knocks, slow, rhythmic, a pattern that felt almost purposeful. She crept to the door, her bare feet whispering against the cold floor. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but the darkness of the porch and the faint outline of the dusty yard. Grace backed away, her skin prickling with a cold sweat. Maybe it was the wind knocking something loose. Maybe. The back door rattled. She spun around, her breath hitching in her throat. The knocking had started up again, this time from the kitchen entrance. 3 steady thumps like something was trying to tap its way inside. Grace clutched her phone. fingers trembling as she dialed her mom's number. Straight to voicemail. Another knock. This time it came from the window. Her bedroom window. Impossible. Grace ran to her room, slamming the door shut and flicking on every light she could find. The knocking followed her. Windows, walls, doors, like something was circling the house, pounding insistently as if the wood and brick and glass were the only things holding it at bay. She cowered under her blankets, tears stinging her eyes. The knocking never stopped, just grew louder, more forceful. It became a part of the night, a heartbeat she couldn't escape. Then came the voice, old, cracking, like dry leaves crushed underfoot. "Please, let me in." She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood. Her phone slipped from her grasp and hit the floor with a muffled thud. "Please," the voice rasped, the words sliding through the gaps in the window frame. "Just let me in." The knocking continued until dawn. When Grace's parents returned that morning, they found her curled up in the hallway, her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes swollen from crying. She was unconscious from exhaustion, her breaths shallow, her skin clammy. They called the police. The officers came, looked around, asked Grace a few half-hearted questions once she'd been coaxed awake. She couldn't explain what she'd heard, what she'd felt. Her father kept talking about coyotes or teenagers playing pranks, but Grace knew better. She'd seen the muddy footprints, bare, small, too large to be a child's, but too small to be an adult's. They led from the porch, tracing a path around the house, and then impossibly up to her bedroom window. They stopped there, as if something had been waiting. The police wrote it off as a stray animal. Grace didn't argue, but every night from then on she slept with her door locked and the lights blazing bright. No one ever mentioned the footprints again, and Grace didn't dare ask if anyone else could hear the knocking.